G'day, my name's Joel Meadows from the Green Hand Institute, and today we're going to talk about hot compost. Composting. There's lots of different ways that people compost. Plastic bins in the backyard, worm farms or compost tumblers, to home constructed bays, or even just piles where people build up their compost heap in the corner of a garden. We're going to focus today on hot composting, which is a process that actually uses the microbes that are present in the material that we're composting to actually heat up and speed up the composting process. But there's also lots of reasons why people compost. Sometimes we're just trying to get rid of stuff from the garden or from the kitchen, but a lot of us are aware that actually if we put organic material into the bin that then gets buried in landfill, we're actually going to create methane, because that organic material is going to get squashed, and without the presence of oxygen it's going to break down anaerobically. That's going to produce a lot of methane. So we get problematic amounts of greenhouse causing gases of methane coming out of our landfills because of organic waste going in there. So we don't want to do that. We want to process this material in our backyard, and also it's really good stuff. If we've got a garden and we're growing things, whether it's vegetables or fruit trees or even just ornamentals, this stuff is gold. So we want to keep that organic material on site, but we want to make sure that we're composting as best as we can so that we're not producing unnecessary amounts of carbon dioxide, and definitely not producing methane with our compost system. So hot composting is a great way to process a lot of material, do it in a really clean and efficient way, and make super quality compost. So let's go through the process. So this is a hot compost bay. I only turned this yesterday and it's already up to 30 degrees. I reckon by the end of the week it's going to be pushing over 60 degrees, because we have our compost bays mounted so that they can go downhill. A lot of you won't have access to a slope where you can do this, but it's a way of us managing the turning of the compost where gravity's working for us a little bit. But regardless, one of the key ingredients that we need to make our compost system work is we need a volume of material, and we need something that can contain that. Now theoretically you could just do a big pile and that would be okay, but usually what you'll find is that the pile will then end up being quite a bit bigger because it doesn't have sides holding it together and creating a nice mass of material. So theoretically we need about a cubic metre of material to make a hot compost work. You can go bigger than that, but it's really hard to go smaller than that, because what you start to get is not enough volume for the surface area, and it starts to not get hot enough and to lose too much heat to the surrounding environment. So cubic metre or a little bit bigger is a great place to start. If we go much bigger, even 1.5 metres each dimension, we're going to end up with heaps more volume on the inside, and that's just going to take longer to build up. So usually something around the 1 metre to 1.2 metre dimension each direction is about a good place to start for a backyard composting system. Now we've got timber and corrugated iron holding our system together. A lot of people use slatted timbers for the whole thing, and that's great because you do get more oxygen through that. But as I'm going to show you later, I actually don't think what the bay is made of makes that big a difference, because actually it's the way we put the ingredients together that are going to get the oxygen into the pile. So don't worry too much about what you make it out of, but even simple stacking up a bunch of straw bales can be a great way to start. You get air movement through those, they insulate the pile quite well, and they'll start to break down over time, and then they can become a part of the compost. That's great too. So something to contain the pile that's about a cubic metre. When we're setting up our system for holding our compost, it's a great idea to actually make 3 separate bays that can each hold a cubic metre of material. One to build up our compost in, the second one to turn into so that we do our first aeration, and then the third one to do the next turn into, and for material to do its final breakdown and then be distributed to the garden. That way we can have one being built, one cooking and going off, and the other one being distributed to the garden, and they can each be running at the same time. Then we're going to have to think about the ingredients that go into it, and we'll think about that in detail. We've got to think about the carbon-nitrogen ratio, we've got to think about the moisture and the oxygen getting into it, and then we've got to think about the diversity of what we're putting together to make our hot composting work. When we think about compost ingredients, we need to divide them roughly into two categories, things that are high in nitrogen and things that are high in carbon. Now, almost all living material will have some amount of carbon and some amount of nitrogen in it, but they're in different balance. So what we generally do is say things that are, leafy greens, or things that would go off if we left them in a pile or in a wet bucket or something like that, and would get really stinky within a few days. They're generally high in nitrogen. If they're things that are more dry and woody or sort of brown ingredients, those things are generally higher in carbon. And we kind of go from, extremes like sawdust, which is very high in carbon, has a tiny amount of nitrogen, through to leafy weeds or really rich manures like chook manure that's really high in nitrogen, has a smaller amount of carbon. We're looking to blend those things in the right balance, which is somewhere between 25 to 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. Now, how are you going to work that out? Well, it's all right. We've got some rules of thumb that we can work with that are going to get it about in balance. Straw is a really useful carbon-rich ingredient for our compost. It's readily available in our area. This is just a little roadside stall that's on the edge of town, but usually you can find them around the place, or farmers advertise small bales like this, or large squares and large round bales through the local paper. And because we've got a lot of farms in the area, it's a readily available agricultural waste product. One of the beautiful things about straw fibres, or any of the other, like this is wheaten straw, but any of the other straws, is usually they've got quite good hollow fibres through the middle, and that provides aeration through the compost. So as we put layers of the straw in, we're adding carbon to the pile, but we're also allowing oxygen to get into the pile deeper. Okay, so autumn leaves like these are pretty fantastic carbon addition to the compost pile as well. They're, depending on the type, they're going to give us different kinds of qualities of how much they mat down and how they work in a compost pile. But unless they're really big, wet leaves, they tend not to clump too much. Ones like this off these oaks are pretty light and fluffy, and we can collect them well in advance of our compost making, because they'll stack up in a pile and can wait ready for building a hot compost pile. So they're quite versatile in that respect. Sometimes very wet, big plane tree leaves can actually mat down and become a bit of a problem in the pile. So we might need to run those through a mulcher or make sure we've broken them up before we add them to the pile. But this kind of stuff, that's perfect. It's going to be really good, and it's going to have a lot more residual nutrient than just a plain straw, and heaps more than something like sawdust or cardboard or newspaper. So a bag of roadside horse manure like this is actually just stuff that's been picked up off the paddock. So it's mostly horse manure. It's got a little bit of grass through it, but it's basically mostly manure. So it's the manure itself is going to have a carbon nitrogen ratio of about 25 to 1, but different manures are different. And what we have to watch for too is, does the manure include bedding material? And that bedding material will often be straw or sawdust or other ingredients like that, and that's going to mean lots more carbon and a lot less nitrogen. So horse poo like this is not far off being the perfect balance that we need in our compost, but obviously we've got to break it up a little bit because it will clump and not be very good in the compost pile on its own. And the other thing we have to watch for is, if you can, speak to the owner of the horse and see that the horse hasn't been wormed, or whatever the animal is, hasn't been wormed recently, because the worming treatment will actually damage the worms in our compost pile. If it's a pile of manure that's been left for a while, that worming treatment dissipates over time, but if it's really fresh stuff, we don't want to hurt our worms in our compost pile, so we might need to be aware of what's gone into it. Another kind of manure that's available absolutely everywhere is human manure or humanure. Now, it's well beyond the scope of this video for me to go into the details of how to compost humanure, but if you're interested, the Humanure Handbook is a great resource by Joseph Jenkins, and he's got great information on his website as well. But human waste has a carbon-nitrogen ratio of about 7:1, so really high in nitrogen. And of course, if we deal with it really well with hot composting and pasteurization processes, it makes for a fantastic compost addition, but you have to know what you're doing and you have to be really careful with it, of course. At the end of a season in the garden, we've got a whole lot of things that we're pulling out. You know, I'm just pulling out these old basil stems today, but these will be fantastic in the compost. They're woody material, so they're a little bit higher in carbon than they are in nitrogen, but they're actually pretty close to balance, and they're going to provide great aeration through the pile. So all this it's free stuff that we generate from our own gardens, and we need to deal with it. So it's perfect stuff to go through the compost. Some of the tougher stuff we might want to chop up, but if we make it too fine, it will compact a little bit more. So we want to keep enough aeration through it. So leafy green weeds or things that we grow in our garden are really useful to add to our compost as well. There's a range of ones that get called dynamic accumulators. Now that's not a technical term, but what it refers to is any plants that have deep roots that draw up nutrient from deep down in the soil and pull that up and bring that to the surface through their leaves. So when we collect stuff that has great root systems and use their leafy tops, we add that nutrient to our compost pile. This is comfrey, which is sort of the king of the dynamic accumulators, but actually there's a bunch of other ones that work for us that we might plant, or might just be weeds in our area that we can make use of in our compost. So I'm going to collect a fair bit of this as we go. So some of these leafy greens, a lot of people would call them weeds, are really useful in our compost pile. So here we've got borage, dock, mallow. So lots of these things will be great in our compost pile. They'll be reasonably high in nitrogen. They're already wet and they're very rich in nutrient. So they'll be a great addition to our compost pile to balance up some of those drier things, like the drier woody plant materials, as well as the leaves and the straw. And these things will add diversity and nutrient complexity to our compost that we can't get in easy forms from other things. Grass and grass clippings are a common thing that people want to put in compost piles. Lush green grass like this is going to be higher in nitrogen, whereas drier, woodier grass like this will actually have close to the perfect balance of carbon-nitrogen for our compost pile. So you would know that if we took lush green grass, particularly chopped fine through a lawnmower, and build it in a pile, it can go slimy and nasty. So we have to watch that. We have to cut it with some drier material as we layer it up. Whereas material like this could actually be cut and stored for a long time and would probably be fine. Might go a little bit moldy, but it'll be reasonably okay. So grass, depending on its different states, lush green or dry and woody, will have different effects, and we'll have to handle them differently, but they'll both be really valuable. All the stuff that comes out of the kitchen, we divide into two main categories. There's the kitchen scraps, which is the peels and the trimmings and stuff like that. And then we've got food waste, which is things like ends of bread or bowls of food that didn't get eaten and are scraped out. That stuff is much better if we can feed that to chooks or other animals, because then rodents aren't going to get their hands on it. We can put that stuff in the compost if it's an active hot compost, but if it's not, it is going to be a bit of a rodent magnet. But this other stuff is great in our compost. It's got reasonably high nitrogen content, but it's also got lots of other sort of stemmy, carbon-rich stuff So that goes in regularly, and if we can get our hands on other stuff, so trimmings from a greengrocer, or if neighbours have got kitchen scraps that they are wanting to contribute to your compost pile, go for it. Clay-rich soil is another one of those secret ingredients that actually, if we don't put it into our compost, we're really not going to make great stuff. We need to add some rich soil that's already been through a garden bed, and if our soil doesn't have a high clay content, we might need to add some clay as well. And this has a few different effects. It brings in a lot of the microbes that we want to process the nutrient in the compost pile, but it will also have a particular effect where it will actually lock up more of the nitrogen than if we don't add it. And it also has a slightly slowing effect on the heating of the pile, and that's good too, just to put the brakes on a little bit. If we did a perfect carbon nitrogen blend with no soil in it, it'd heat up really quickly and it would collapse really quickly. So the soil interlayers into our compost pile will actually slow things down a little bit, but also absorb more of the potential that is there and make a considerably better finished product than we would if we left it out. Biochar is a little bit of a wild card ingredient that I'm going to add but not expect everyone has access to. Biochar is charcoal, but it's been made specifically to be a good addition to soil and to actually put carbon back into the soil in a really long-term way. So the difference between biochar and just normal charcoal is biochar is always light and clinky, and it doesn't have oily stuff in it, so it doesn't stain our hands. It will, with a bit of water, we can wash our hands of it, and we don't have oily residues left over. So this is biochar that we've made on the site with just twigs and stuff from our property, so it's a part of our bushfire reduction strategy. But you can also buy biochar now. It's becoming more and more readily available, which is great. But you might be interested in making it, but that's kind of beyond the scope of this video. But I will throw it in because it is a great addition to compost, and we've been using it for the last few years and having really good results with it. Seaweed is another one of our wildcard ingredients. Not everyone's going to have access to it. We collect seaweed and dry it out and bring it back to put in our garden. The beauty of seaweed is that it's grown in the ocean, and the ocean is where all the nutrient from the land ends up washing to. So the sea has all the missing ingredients that have washed off this depleted landscape that we live in, and the plants in the ocean are actually concentrating those nutrients back into their bodies. So when we bring those things back here, we're kind of closing a cycle where we're bringing some of that nutrient back here and growing food and putting it back into the soil. It'll eventually end up back in the ocean, but we can keep those cycles going for quite a while. So if you can get access to seaweed, it's a great addition to our compost. You can also make seaweed teas and then add them to the compost as well. If you don't want to harvest it yourself, you can buy commercially harvested seaweed, usually from pet supplies or stock feed places. But just check, there are rules around seaweed harvesting, so make sure you know what those are and try and adhere to those as you can. There are some really high carbon materials that we have ready access to. Newspaper, cardboard, and sawdust. Now, these things are really high in carbon. So newspaper has a carbon nitrogen ratio of 175, sawdust 350, and cardboard around the 325 mark. Obviously, these are approximates. The problem with these materials is there's almost no decent nutrient in them, but we have to be careful. If they are making up the bulk of the carbon in our compost, we're going to have a pretty empty compost at the other end. So we might get our carbon nitrogen ratio right, but end up with a real lack of nutrient diversity at the end of our compost. A lot of compost guides will talk about putting lime in your compost. Lime comes in a few different forms. This is ground up limestone, which gets called agricultural lime or ag lime, but there is also hydrated lime and there's quick lime. Now, we don't want to put quick lime in our garden or in our compost, but hydrated lime or agricultural lime can be used to correct imbalances in the chemical makeup of our garden and our compost. So if our compost is really acidic, adding lime will actually reduce that acidity and move it towards being a bit more alkaline. And ideally we're aiming for it to be neutral, not alkaline or acidic. Generally, if our gardens are in good health and things are running well, we actually don't have to worry too much about our compost. When we're doing a rich carbon nitrogen balanced compost like this with lots of material in it, we're not going to end up with a highly acidic compost. So you can add a bit of lime if you think your garden needs it, but it's actually not super essential in a hot composting pile like this. If all you're doing is collecting kitchen scraps, then they're going to be quite acidic by the time you build up a compost out of those, and that's where lime can be a really important addition. But in our case, you can do it if you think your garden needs it, but I don't spend a lot of time worrying about the pH balance of my compost. I worry about it in my soil and correct it there. As our gardens start to improve, we can grow more of our compost ingredients on site. The thing we have to be careful of though is if our soils are depleted of nutrients and we're using those materials to make our compost, we can exacerbate nutrient deficiency. So that's where those dynamic accumulators and seaweed, special stuff that comes in from outside that can improve the quality of our compost become really important. We have our ingredients together, so we're ready to start making compost. We're going to start by putting a layer of dry woody material right down the bottom, and that's going to make sure that we've got great oxygenation at the base of the pile. And then we're going to start layering it up. Some people describe it as being like making a lasagna, where we're putting thin layers of the different materials and building them up as we go. What we've got to watch for is that we're keeping our carbon-nitrogen balance about right, and that's usually helped by just making sure that we're getting a diversity of different things in. If we put some nitrogen-rich material down, make sure it's followed by a layer of carbon-rich material. And we'll build it up until we get to the top and we've got a cubic metre ready to go. Some of you might like to build your pile in one go. Get all the material together, do one big bay in a day and get it started. I find that that's a bit tricky to do, and it doesn't really work in with us having material coming out of the kitchen and out of the garden on a regular basis. So I like to do this system which I call the 3/3 approach. When the top bay is empty, we start by filling it up with about 1/3 cubic metre of material, and we layer it up in the lasagna style. That starts getting hot. It's not a fully cooking bay, but it's starting to get hot, which means that we can start to add things like kitchen and garden scraps in there in layers, and it will already start to be heating up. It also means that we're less likely to have issues with rodents because it's already getting uncomfortably hot for them, and that's really good for keeping our pile relatively clean. That next third of the pile we can build up as we get materials from our kitchen or from the garden or other things we salvage, and we can layer it up slowly, managing our carbon nitrogen as we do it. And then when we're getting near the top, we can do that final third with just a collection of materials, and that way we've got our cubic metre ready to go. It might take a month or two to build up that middle third layer, but that way we always have somewhere to put our compost out of the kitchen or out of the garden, and we're building a getting ready hot compost pile that's about to go off when it turns. At that point, we've got a cubic metre of material and we're ready to turn or tumble, depending on what your system is, and actually get that material blended up and completely oxygenated. At that point too, we're starting to be cooks in the kitchen. We're looking at the ingredients that we've put into our pile, and we might make adjustments at that point. We might say, oh, there's not enough carbon-rich material, it's a bit slimy and a bit soggy, and we put some more dry stuff in. Or it might be that it's a bit too dry and we need some more manures or green leafies in there. At that point, we can still blend and cut it. We've also got to make sure that our moisture content is right, and ideally our compost, when it's going through this process, will be wet enough that no part of it ever feels dry, but not so wet that we could squeeze moisture out of it. And I think of it like a squeezed out sponge, where it's damp to the touch, but we couldn't make water drip out of it. Now, how will you know that? Well, as you're doing your turning of the compost, you'll be watching for that. And if it's in the middle of summer, it might be quite dry, or the materials that you've put in have been more carbon rich, and it's just the whole pile's a little bit dry and not getting hot and not really looking very active, then you might actually squirt some water in there. You might add a little bit more leafy greens and nitrogen-rich material as you're doing that turn to get it right. And so we're changing the material makeup if we're not happy with what we've got. We're also turning, so we're taking the center of the pile and moving it to the outside, and we're taking the outside and moving it to the inside. And we're also taking a cross-sectional cut of all of our lasagna layers. So we're mixing stuff from the older stuff to the newer stuff. And the new pile that we make then is a complete mix-up of what we originally had. And that is going to take off. If you use the thirds technique, you'll still have hot compost going in the first bay, but it won't get really hot. So it's that initial tumbling or turning that will really get it activated, and it's likely to go up to 68 degrees or somewhere around that. That might last for a couple of weeks, even past a month, and then it will start to taper off a bit. Now, you don't need a compost thermometer to find that out. You can stick your finger in, or you can put a piece of metal or something like that in and feel the temperature in the core when you pull it out. So it just it's really just a feel thing. We don't have to get really precise about it. So that will start to taper off. Then we want to turn it again, and we want to do the same thing where we're mixing the inside to the outside, and we're taking a cross section of the layers and we're fluffing it all up again. It will probably heat up again if it hasn't rested for too long, and it will go up again, sometimes again to 68 degrees, but it will taper off quicker. And at this point, some magic can happen. What we'll find is when it starts to cool, it will actually get completely infested with worms. So there'll be worms running through the whole thing for quite a few weeks. If we can rest it for a month or more, the worms will work through the whole thing, and after a while they'll mostly vacate, but they will leave a considerably better compost at the end of their visit, and we want to encourage that if we can. So we need our compost system to be open enough that worms can come and go as they please. They won't be able to cope with the high temperatures of hot composting, and they'll vacate as long as they've got access to get out. But then they'll come back in again when it's ready, and they'll work it over beautifully. So we want to encourage the worms to do their magic. Those worms will lift the quality of our compost several notches. And at the end of that, we've got top quality compost to go out to the garden, into our orchards, around our fruit trees, around our ornamentals, or wherever we want to improve soil. So that's the basics of hot compost making. I actually made my first batch of hot compost when I was 14. I was working as a gardener for this amazing Austrian woman, and I remember her dancing around crazily as we layered up the compost. There was something magical, artistic in the air. And as much as it's important to pay attention to the ratios and the moisture content, it's a lot about feel. In fact, Peter Bennett, in his book Organic Gardening, says, "With experience, it's surprising how unscientific one can be and still produce excellent compost, developing after a while a reliable gut feel about mixtures and techniques." So get out there, start making piles, watch what happens, learn as you go, and keep doing it. That's all from me. Bye.